But first we'll continue with our next speaker. She's a postdoctoral researcher here at Utrecht University. And she works also for the Visions of the Future project, which investigates and compares alternatives to neoliberal capitalism. And they research a lot of these alternatives for the future, such as degrowth and post-growth, the care economy, property democracy, and authoritarian populism, and even more. So we invited her to reflect on Mr. Finkelstein's story and also maybe add some to it. So please, a very warm applause for Hannah McHugh.
Hello. Okay, so I'll try and pick up exactly where Professor Finkelstein left off. Tonight, we were advertised our populists turning into fascists, and so I can imagine all of you are concerned to understand how we interpret increasingly far-right recent movements. And to that end, here I have some pictures of three very different leaders, but perhaps, like me, you share this intuition that there's something that just looks and feels similar about these kinds of politics. So Professor Finkelstein has really eloquently set out his view that these leaders perhaps could be described as wannabe fascists, if not fascists. But he's done that by arguing they operate inside democratic systems while drawing on fascist traditions. In particular, he summarized their violence, lies and propaganda, dictatorship, and xenophobia as crucial features of fascism. In this talk and reflection, I would like to focus on these fascist traditions as cultural movements and therefore emphasize some other aspects that we see in fascism. Professor Finkelstein's very stark warning to us is that democracy can erode from within. And I'm going to consider how in this talk that involves not just the decay of institutions and laws and rights, but how cultural narratives and symbols and imagery can reorient our society. And I'll finish by emphasizing that to resist fascism, we can't just protect our democratic institutions, but more we need to reinvigorate our democratic culture. So fascist stories, and cultural stories in particular, center on very predictable elements. There's this famous hat you can see here, which says, "Make America Great Again." That draws on a long-held fascist preoccupation with a sense of national rebirth for a humiliated or declining nation. Here you can see Narendra Modi, who is using similar rhetoric. India is now striving to regain its lost strength. Fascists lean on this idea of the strong leader, and at the same time, they're dissolving the distinction between the leader and the state and political morality. So Trump's quote here, "I am your justice," I think captures that very well. And we can see, Bolsonaro's ultra-nationalist claim, "Brazil above everything, God above everyone." So I'm going to try and explain some of the cultural power or the nature of these narratives. But to do so, I think first we need to ask the question, in what conditions can these fascist cultural stories thrive? Or perhaps another way to put that is, why are we seeing this now? Fascism first arose in the early 20th century in conditions of very profound structural crisis. So after the First World War, it's quite evident that political orders were absolutely shattered. Systems of empire were beginning to collapse, and we were seeing the shifting of the global hegemon towards the United States. Meanwhile, industrialization was heralding in mass change. So there was a pull of workers from regions to cities, leaving behind collapsing and shrinking communities, and a new mass media was rapidly changing social life. With that mass media and the rise of mass society, there was a financial crisis which totally undermined that mass society's faith in existing political orders. So I've characterized here on the slides the crisis in global economic, work, and its social dimensions. And taken together, I think that I could suggest that this led to what we might describe as a crisis of profound political disorientation. So in times of political disorientation, clearly what follows is that people want orientation. There is a need for political orientation. And indeed, a century ago, 3 political movements rose trying to offer direction in all of this uncertainty, and we saw the battle between communism, liberal democracy, and fascism. It's a room full of smart people, so I'm sure you'll already be drawing comparisons with the 21st century. And today we face not new, but also not unsimilar challenges and changes. So the global order that was agreed upon after World War II, which centered on American economic and political leadership, is now strained. The 2008 financial crisis undermined faith in the political order and heralded in periods of significant austerity and preceded an unprecedented rise in global inequality. Globalization, financialization, and digitalization have significantly reshaped not only our working lives by rendering employment increasingly precarious and remote, but they've also reshaped our mass communications. Much of our lives now unfold online. As many of the decisions that shape our lives seem to move further out of our reach, it's harder and harder to see who or what is responsible. We might not actually know if there are real people behind the algorithms that determine our social feeds, or which jobs were offered, or make bureaucratic decisions on our behalf. And likewise, it might be difficult to recognize whether the market we are subject to really reflects human choices or is some kind of natural force beyond anyone's control. And at the same time, modern mass media makes it harder for us to access reliable information, and with that, our shared sense of truth is increasingly unstable. So we too live in times of profound political disorientation. So what is political disorientation? Even the slides pronounced it wrong with an N on the bottom there. I would suggest that disorientation can be readily understood with 3, perhaps seemingly simple, but I suggest hard to answer questions. What is lost when we are disoriented is a ready sense of who is in control of the power I'm subject to? How can I understand and contest the injustice that I feel? And how can I understand myself and my place in society? Fascist narratives hold very ready answers to these complex questions. And I'm going to talk through them, and I'll talk through them in their cultural, moral, and aesthetic terms. So, first, fascist stories. The fascist imaginary begins by constructing histories of national greatness. So for Mussolini, this was the Roman Empire. For Hitler's Germany, this was the mythological Aryan civilization. And these historically great nations, we are told, have been humiliated and weakened and corrupted by enemies, whether that's Jews, communists, or otherwise. And if only we could rid these nations from the corrupting influence, then they could be reborn. Now, fascist movements don't just promise reform, they promise something more, which is regeneration. So on these stories, violence and exclusion are not seen as acts of cruelty, but rather they're necessary acts of renewal. And what is it that they promise? They promise a glorious future. So early fascist movements came along with artistic movements such as futurism. I've pulled an example here. So the industrial age was being glorified in a way that politics and culture and art was merging together into one consistent story. A renewed civilization was going to be driven forward by strength and motion and technological domination. Now, interestingly, I think elements of these stories recur today. A mythical greatness of the past, but perhaps now sat along something like a techno-futurist narrative. Last week, Quinn Slobodian was here in Utrecht, and he spoke about Elon Musk's pushes to colonize Mars, his interest in breaking down the boundaries between humans and AI technology, and how these aims are justified with reference to the need for civilizational survival. So today, too, we are seeing a pairing of social conservatism and futurist elements. But how, though, can we justify, or are these stories being justified? So quite understandably, you might be uncomfortable seeing the title Fascist Morality. Maybe you think that's abhorrent. Maybe you think it's oxymoronic. I am making no claim that I think fascism is a moral form of politics, but I do want to clarify that it starts from a very fundamentally different moral premise than liberalism. So I think clarifying this is important because it helps us understand the internal justification of these orders. So for liberals, broadly conceived, when I say liberals, I mean those who adhere to liberalism. You could be a Green, you could be a centre-right, traditional centre-right. The first premise of politics for you will be a commitment to the equal moral worth of individuals. So the first unit of political value is the person. And then the task of a political order is to mediate the normal disagreements of political life while respecting the equal moral worth of all the members of its society. So this tends towards a commitment to pluralism, to mutually supporting political freedom, and toleration as we coexist together. Liberal political institutions exist not to enforce a single unified will, but to allow people with different beliefs and identities and toleration to coexist together. Conversely, for fascists, the first premise of politics is not the individual, it is in fact the collective. The fascist politics begins from the idea that society should be imagined like a living body. And then if something is wrong with one individual within that living body, like a disease, they can be excluded and they can be eradicated. It is a brutal logic, but it's internally coherent. If the body is going to survive, then parts of it might be expended. And on this premise, the people or the nation is understood not as a collection of individuals, but as one collective entity with a shared destiny. And the health of the collective body becomes the highest political value. So baked into this idea of the collective lies a very deeply hierarchical view of human beings. Stories that emphasize purity and strength, often, as I say, paired with this idealized vision of a glorious past, connect the true people, the nation, to a specific land. And together, these stories and these narratives can reinforce the belief that some people are inherently superior to others. Okay, so having shown then the moral premise of fascism and how this links to strong cultural narratives, one very important further aspect remains to be attended to as we respond to how fascism produces or responds to political disorientation. So fascism does not work through abstract ideas or arguments about institutions or policies. It doesn't just turn up and offer a political program. More than that, fascism offers a way of living. Fascism offers a political experience. It is a visible and it is an embodied form of politics. So one thing that I think is very well understood by the far right is that often politics is downstream from culture. So we can consider how fascism uses symbols and imagery and identity to attract and coordinate its followers. And often these cultural and aesthetic clues can elicit an emotional experience in us. So to make a general example of what I mean by this kind of aesthetic clue, which is non-specific to fascism, it's possible to be moved by the waving of a flag, by the pull of a march, by the singing of a national anthem, without having a full personal account of your own relation to those things. As a British woman, I enjoy singing God Save the King, whatever my views of the British monarchy happen to be. We can be moved aesthetically by these performances. Now, fascism goes further than just the waving of a flag. Fascism goes further than merely displaying some sort of nationalist aesthetic. Fascism is itself an aestheticized form of politics. And it's extraordinarily effective at this level. It's extraordinarily effective at offering a lived and felt vision of meaning and belonging in times of disorientation. The philosopher Walter Benjamin captured something very essential, I think, about this dynamic. Benjamin argued that fascism responds to mass discontent not by transforming the underlying economic structures of society, but by aestheticizing politics. And by this, he is saying that instead of giving people real political agency over the forces that shape their lives, fascist movements instead give them dramatic forms of expression. So fascism offers everyday citizens a way of being in the place of political power and in the place of undermining the structural kinds of domination that disoriented them in the first place. So by operating through mass rallies or synchronized crowds or military spectacles or monumental architecture, people are invited to feel powerful as part of some collective drama. Fascists are creating a visual impression of a perfectly ordered and powerful society using this metaphor of the powerful body. And I think importantly and interestingly, this way of being can also operate very much at the level of individuals. So at the individual level, the level of each of us, it can offer direction. Strength, power, and purity can be physically embodied. So individual bodies can be displayed as symbols of collective vitality, as Susan Sontag observed, strength and discipline can become both personal and political virtues, and idealized gender roles are therefore celebrated within fascist traditions. So to try and make this clearer, I've selected some images. In the center here, you can see the front page of Action, the newspaper of Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists in 1936, highlighting this aestheticized ideal of masculinity. And next to this, I have shown an image from, I don't know if anyone's seen the new Louis Theroux on Netflix, inside the manosphere. But the manosphere is a term which describes online media influencers associated with the far right who deliver highly aestheticized content displaying hypermasculinity together with strongly misogynist tones. And then similarly, you can see a propagandistic painting by Adolf Wissel from 1939 in Germany, which depicts a traditional role of motherhood. And I've paired this with a headline which refers to recent trends of tradwives. Tradwives are women who are supposedly bucking the trends of female emancipation through work and seeking to adopt more traditional and submissive gender roles. So I think taken together, we now have a way of revisiting the challenge of disorientation. So the first question was, who is in control of the power I'm subjected to? Would the fascists answer? The once strong nation is corrupted by elites and betrayers or external contaminants. How can I understand and contest the injustice that I feel? A strong man leader must lead the nation and the true people to a glorious rebirth. And how can I understand myself and my place in society? Well, as part of the collective, I must strive to uphold myself as a pure, strong, and disciplined member of the nation's traditional society. I must participate and advance towards a glorious future in the process of national rebirth. And so, it seems, fascism is especially effective in times of disorientation and is offering a cultural story to those who suffer under that disorientation. However, at this point, you might reasonably be thinking, wait a minute, the leaders and the vanguards of these movements often are very wealthy, are privileged, are full of hypocrisies, and they don't actually suffer under this disorientation, or perhaps even believe in some of the fascist answers that are proposed. Well, I would say you were correct. Fascism has always involved this very important alliance between the elites of the movement and the masses, and actually, and importantly, their incentives could diverge significantly. So to explain this, I've already said that I think fascism involves a very hierarchical view of society. On such a view, the special treatment of those at the top of the hierarchy is absolutely plausible for these movements. So the tech billionaires, representative of a glorious future and most hailed among men, they are all men, for their perceived meritocratic success, are easily afforded extra rights and public and political valorization. Similarly, corruption and hypocrisy among leaders of these movements is not seen as contravention of the premise of liberal equality. Rather, they are courageous expressions of a movement. The leader is the nation embodied, acting for the collective, and is valued as such. So this is why corruption and unconstitutional behavior undermines the left and center, but actually rarely touches the support held for the far right. Now, however, arguably and more fundamentally, this divergence between the elites and the masses relates to a crucial final feature of fascism that I'll emphasize. It's a non-exhaustive list of features. They're just pulling out some alternatives to what we've had already. But something that I think must be discussed and can't be ignored is fascism's relation to capitalism. Fascism does not seek to dismantle capitalism or to rectify inequalities. So today I've set out that, or I've hinted that many are disoriented by the effects of neoliberal markets, financial systems, global supply chains, and technological infrastructures that are shaping our lives in profound ways while appearing impersonal. These interacting elements appear alongside vastly widening inequalities and increasingly pressing risk of climate catastrophe. Yet fascist regimes do not seek to undermine these logics, even if they lead to these outcomes, and they preserve the features of fascism, of capitalism, that have made them possible. For instance, they preserve private property, they preserve profit incentives. Historically, fascist movements have relied heavily on industry elites and suppressed labor movements. They've mobilized industry and capital only in the service of their national power. So in other words, capitalism remained largely intact, but it was embedded within a strongly authoritarian political order. So today, talks of deregulation, moves to uphold tech elites and the wealth of billionaires, denial of welfare to those who are not considered part of the hierarchical in-group, actually follow a consistent political logic. Libertarian economic rhetoric can combine with an authoritarian political leadership to reinforce the existing structures of power. The elites are offering the masses an expressive politics while hoarding and justifying their own wealth and power. So in this sense, as I say, fascist politics does not challenge the structures that produce disorientation. The fascist vision of the future cements and reifies capitalist inequality. So here on the slides, I've pulled an excellent collection of primary sources that identifies Mussolini's style of crony capitalism, but I've also put a picture here from Trump's inauguration, where I think it's interesting that tech billionaires were chosen to sit at the front, hailed as some kind of national pride for their financial and technological so-called success as an example of this reification. So tentatively at this point, we can summarize some features of what a fascist vision for the future may look like. Reified capitalist and social inequality within a hierarchical and exclusionary society justified by a collective and organic moral worldview. Quite grim, quite scary, but I don't want to end there. Having just painted this scary picture of how democracies can erode from within, including with culture, I'd actually like to end by making a few observations as to what democratic resistance against wannabe fascists might be. So the challenge, I think, that is raised by these arguments is, what is the culture of democracy? What does a liberal democracy look and feel like? So if fascism is offering a world that feels clear and morally ordered at the collective level, yet still livable by individuals, in conditions of disorientation, it's not going to be enough for us to appeal to abstract feelings, to institutions, to procedures, or to rights. At the personal level, this won't offer a way of living or a way of being that resonates. Technical solutions and fixes will represent a decaying order and actually risk increasing the perceived gap between people and their democratic governments. Courts can slow fascism, and for now, elections can challenge it, but we need to operate at a much deeper level. To truly protect these institutions, we need to argue for and show what a democratic culture can really offer. We need to make a democratic movement capable of actually moving people. So the democratic vision for the future, I'll sketch some ideas here. I'd love to hear more what others in the room think, because it truly is our challenge. But I would suggest it should draw on the already strong assets that we have within democratic culture. The emphasis of solidarity, mutual care, respect, diversity, difference, all of these need to be celebrated. We should paint a vision for the future that undermines the structures that disempower agents politically. There should be material change. And we need to build a cultural movement that supports this political project. We need a reinvigorated and lived culture of democracy. So to finally respond to the question, are populists turning into fascists? Well, we may not be there yet, but certainly elements of fascist politics has re-emerged, and we need to be, as Professor Finkelstein said, very vigilant to stop wannabe fascists from dismantling our democratic culture. And I hope this talk has equipped you with some tools to recognize how that happens and how we might resist. Thank you.